Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. A while back, George Smart interviewed Kyle Bergman, director of the Architecture and Deisgn Film Festival in New York City. Today's special bonus edition of US Modernist Radio features George and the stars, producers, and creators of the latest architecture documentaries, recorded in New York at the Architecture and Deisgn Film Festival late last year. George's first guest today is Sarah Howitt, producer and director of Building Hope, the Maggie Centers, beautiful architect-designed facilities for patients with cancer and their families in the UK. Next, George is joined by Thatcher Bean, producer of Made in Ilima, which tracks the collective building process of a modern school and community center in Ilima, a town in a remote and ecologically sensitive region of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
This is George Smart, and I am recording today in New York City at the Architecture and Deisgn Film Festival. My first guest is Sarah Howitt. She is producer and director of Building Hope, the Maggie Centers. She is a BAFTA award-winning documentary filmmaker, and she lives and works in Glasgow, Scotland. She's worked in television in the United Kingdom for over 20 years and has been all over the world. She does a lot of documentaries, but has been commissioned frequently by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and she has a special interest in culture and the humanities, arts, and social history. Her film, Building Hope, the Maggie Centers, features interviews with Frank Gehry, Richard Rogers, and Norman Foster, and was a real labor of love. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, nice to be here.
So tell us about the Maggie Centers and how that got started. I understand there was actually a person named Maggie.
That's right. A woman named Maggie Keswick-Jenks, who grew up and lived in Scotland. She was a landscape architect, and she was, in her kind of 30s, diagnosed with terminal cancer. And she and her husband, Charles Jenks, who is a world-renowned landscape architect, of course, their story is that they were told this awful diagnosis in a classic British NHS hospital. We love the NHS, but in terms of architecture and comfort, it's not the nicest environment. And Maggie was told the news that she was dying, essentially, and was put out into a corridor to sit in a plastic chair. And she thought, there's got to be more to it than this. So they had this idea. I suppose this was a moment of epiphany. And this was in Edinburgh in Scotland. And they managed over time to acquire a property where they wanted to build something better for people who were having this awful experience of going through cancer. And the first centre was built in Edinburgh, right next to the Western General Hospital. It was a little stable block. They converted it with a local architect. But the Maggie Centres at that moment were born, and little did she know, unfortunately she did die some years later, but now in her name there are more than 20 centres in the world, and they are just wonderful places.
When a family comes to a Maggie Centre, what will they discover?
Well, what Maggie Centres do, it's funny, there's a piece in my film which is a whole segment about what is Maggie's, and one of Maggie's best friend, a woman named Marcia Blakenham, says it's something that they still struggle to define. It's a place where you go for help, essentially, if you have cancer. They're always sited on the grounds of hospitals, NHS hospitals. As of this year, every single major hospital in Scotland has one on site. We're here talking about them because they're all designed uniquely by a different architect, and they happen to be designed by some of the world's major architects.
Names, yes.
Yeah. But when you arrive in a Maggie's, it's all sorts of things. They have what they call a pause space. You walk in, there's no reception area. They don't have any signs. The staff don't wear uniforms, but they are medically qualified. So you have staff who are medically qualified. They can answer all your questions, literally all your questions you could possibly have about cancer. And if they can't, they find out who does. But they're beautiful places, and that's important. You walk in and you feel elevated by the space. People constantly report this. even though they don't quite understand why always. They have stunning architectural furniture. They have soaring ceilings. They're all different. Everyone is unique. But within that, there is an enormous amount of information. Yes, you do find the leaflets and things that you would expect, the literature, but it's more about the relationship with the building and the people that run it. Every centre has a centre head, and they have what they call cancer support specialists. And these are some very special people.
Yes.
So those ingredients are vital to every Maggie's centre, certainly. And they run classes, they run yoga, they run cooking classes, you name it, there's all sorts of things. But it's a very kind of, I guess a holistic approach is the right thing to say, but they're not claiming to heal you, they're making you feel better. That's what it's about. It's about the psychology of cancer as much as anything else, I think.
And I would assume there are programs for the caregivers as well?
Yes. Maggie centres are open not just to the patient, they're to everybody. Anyone who has had any brush with cancer of any kind. So your mother's had cancer, your neighbour's had cancer, it's impacted on you, then you can go there. You're a nurse who deals with cancer patients. Yes, I guess so. Anyone who has had cancer impact on their lives. One of the ways they get people through the door is they offer benefits advice. In the UK, if you have cancer, you are entitled to certain financial benefits. Traditionally, getting particularly men through the door of a place like that means they have to run kind of different innovations. How do we get these people in, particularly as the buildings are quite lofty in some ways? If you look at a beautiful architectural building, there is a risk you may be intimidated by that and not want to come in. So one of the ways they get people in the door is that they have a full-time benefits advisor in every centre who can tell you, right, you might have to take time off work, but you're entitled to this money. And that's a real practical way of helping people. And they run things like men's breakfast. I filmed one for the film where in a very post-industrial area where historically it's been a mining and heavy metals industry. This beautiful little centre sits in a huge big council estate, really quite a depressed area. And they run this breakfast for men I think it's every 2 weeks, might be every month, where they cook bacon and sausage.
Oh, yes, men, rum, rum, rum.
Exactly. And the thing is, all these things, of course, we know that cheap meat is bad and may lead to cancer, but it gets people in the door.
Yes, so bacon does anything.
Indeed. I'm a vegetarian, but if it gets people through the door of these places. And actually, when we first showed the film to Laura Lee, the CEO, she was somewhat horrified by the amount of cake and bacon, because it's not really representative of what they do, but it's one of the many things they do to get people in the door.
So was that particular just to men or to people who are struggling in these economic areas, or was it with both categories?
The breakfast was men. Mm-hmm. It was specifically targeted at men. I think at one time they noticed more women were accessing the centres. There are a number of reasons for that. It's called Maggie's.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people associated it with women and breast cancer, which was what Maggie had, and they statistically noticed that less men were accessing the centres, which is what happens with men in healthcare generally the world over, I think. And so they realised they needed an innovation to get men through the door. So the breakfasts, which are not run in all the centres, but in some, they are billed as men's breakfasts. And
cool.
Men of a certain, it tends to be older men, but it can be anybody, can come and get a free breakfast every month or whatever it is. And
there's a big game on the TV screen at the time.
No. That would be fun. That's not very Maggie's. No screens in Maggie's.
No screens. Okay.
Just beautiful views.
So if my family has somebody with cancer and we've just been diagnosed, I assume someone at NHS is going to tell me about the Maggie Center.
Hopefully.
And I'm going to walk in there. I can take advantage of these different services. Is it all outpatient, or is there a residential component? How does that work?
No, it's just a drop-in scenario. So, Yes, there's no overnight. And that, again, is something that's often misinterpreted. I think people think they're hospices and people don't quite know. They can't grasp what they are often because it is quite an esoteric concept, obviously. But yes, hopefully the hospital will tell you there's a place just over there. And that's the idea. It's very close by. You can point out of the window of the ward sometimes and say, go over there. You're feeling awful today. Go over there. They'll help. I don't have time. I'm a nurse. I'll give you as much time as I can, but go over there. Those people will have time to see you and they'll make time to see you. And that will be an environment into which you will always be welcomed and given the information you might need. So no overnights, no staying in. It's just come and go as you please, or come by appointment for counselling sessions. They have psychologists as well, so there is some very concrete practical information that they can give as well.
How did some of these architects like Richard Rogers and Norman Foster get involved in the Maggie Center project?
Well, I think this could only ever have happened with the people involved that it happened to. I mean, the beginning of the story, Maggie knew them all, basically. She was friends, very good friends, with Frank Gehry. She herself was a landscape architect by profession. And she worked with Frank some years before her death, and they knew each other well. And when the thing got off the ground, I think Charles Jenks, her husband, talks about how they got this. All they really had in mind was get this one centre. It was Maggie's dream. They worked towards it prior to her death. It wasn't finished before she died, but that it was a real motivation for her. She was looking at architects' plans on her deathbed, and they kept working towards it, but they never thought it would go further. So the Frank Gehry thing came about some years later, but I think they did Edinburgh first and Glasgow followed, and those were both converted buildings. So a little stable block, and then second, the Glasgow one was a converted, beautiful little Victorian gatehouse in the grounds of the Western General Hospital in Glasgow. The third one was the Frank Gehry in Dundee, and it was a big, big thing for Maggie's. It changed everything. I think they just had an idea of, we know Frank, let's ask Frank. And there's debate as to whose idea this was, but Marcia Blaken, Maggie's best friend, claims it was her. And I'm buying it. I'm buying it. They knew him. They were in this unique position, so they knew him, but they also knew Richard Rogers. They knew Norman Foster. They knew all these luminaries. And so this was open to them. And so once Frank Gehry did one, they crossed a line and people got interested. And as Charles says, eventually after Gehry had done one, Zaha Hadid had done one, all these people were interested. It became like getting an Oscar. It became like a thing that people wanted to do. And the list today is incredible of who has designed the Maggies and continues to be so. The one I filmed in the building process was Norman Foster. And, people like him don't do small buildings.
No.
It's a tiny little, beautiful little building in Manchester, and he does shopping malls and he does
airports. Yes,
exactly. And he had cancer. You see, he's from Manchester, and he had cancer, and those two things, and knowing Maggie, and this is the thing, because they know her, there is a brief, but they sort of have all absorbed the brief over the years. They just know what the message of Maggie's is.
How has the Maggie Center's concept expanded outside of the United Kingdom? So,
let me remember the first. Frank Gehry's actually done two. It's not as well known. The one he did in Dundee, which is the incredible, iconic one that if you Google Maggie's Frank Gehry, you see this astonishing white building in Dundee.
I want all the listeners now to be Googling Maggie's Frank Gehry.
Absolutely.
Dundee.
It's just...
Get to your screens.
It's a beautiful building. But he also did one in Hong Kong. And I think that was the first one outside the UK. So it started in Scotland, then expanded out to England and Wales. There's not one in Northern Ireland. And then I think Frank Gehry's second one was the first foreign one. There's now one in Tokyo. There's one in the planning in Barcelona. Benedetta Talibu is attached to that.
Yes.
It's coming, I should say. It's in the planning. There are a number in the planning. I don't know how far they want it to go abroad. I think it's a slightly different thing when they're abroad. There's a real core team of people who run the 20 in the UK, or it's slightly less than 20. I think 20 includes Hong Kong. But outside the UK, they're starting to build partnerships because practically, I think the charity can't, afford to be all over the world. It's certainly something that they see as worthwhile, as exploring that.
Has Calatrava done one yet?
Not to my knowledge, but, they could be. It could be in the planning.
If he does one, it'll go over budget, so just be careful. That's always the case.
They have a story about the one that got away, and it was Daniel Libeskind. He designed one many years ago, and again, he knew Maggie and Charles. And when I went to interview Marcia, she opened a drawer in her house and pulled out all these amazing plans, and she said, "Do you know about the one that got away?" And I didn't, actually, and nobody had told me this story before. And I think they still hold out hope that one day Daniel Libeskind will complete his one. I think something happened in the planning process that complicated matters, but hopefully,
he'll come back to it.
I think so. I would think so.
Now, many people in the United States know the Ronald Mcdonald House and its system, which is a residential program.
Mm-hmm.
How does that compare to the Maggie Center idea?
Well, no, I don't know an enormous amount about the Ronald McDonald House. We do have them in the UK. There's one attached to the Children's Hospital in Glasgow. But their fundamental difference is architecture.
Architecture. No golden arches on the Maggie Center?
You got it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about here, but the Ronald McDonald House, certainly in the UK that I know of, is quite a bland building. It's very functional.
Yeah.
Every Maggie Centre is very, very special and a unique piece of architecture. Some you'd love, some you may not, but they're all different and they're all special in their own way. You could drive past the Ronald McDonald House, couldn't you?
You could. A lot of them.
Yeah. They do great work, but...
Yeah. Now, these Maggie Center structures, I imagine that they are actually fulfilling what has been the great promise, in quotes, of architecture for years, that they have people feel a certain way when they come into the building that is hopeful, I would assume, and relaxing.
Yeah.
And what other kinds of feelings are they trying to evoke through the design?
Good question. I guess when you talk about cancer, you're talking about life and death. And it doesn't get much more fundamental than that. And a lot of people reported to me that that organisation contained in that small building had literally saved their lives. Now, that is partly, of course, down to the people that work there. But what they do and how they do it, I think, makes people feel very, very differently. And by, stark contrast to how they felt across the road in the hospital. And I think that contrast is at the heart of what the Maggie's Centre does in its own unique way. You walk into a hospital in the UK, okay, they're beginning to embrace a little of what Maggie's does and understand that architecture makes us feel a certain way. So instead of walking down dark, horrible corridors where there's no natural light, we're starting to see hospitals react to this kind of enlightened architecture. But in a Maggie's Centre, almost all of them are full of light. So immediately you feel lighter yourself, I guess. But you're welcomed, you're made to feel safe, they're warm, they might have a curved wall, they all have a garden. The outside-inside space is crucial. Now, I haven't reread the brief recently, but there is a bit in the brief about how the outside space interacts with the inside space.
Very modernist.
Very modernist. With Charles Jenks on board, it's inevitable having a landscape gardener as part of their DNA, Maggie having been one herself. And there's the one in Lanarkshire where I talked about the breakfast they had. It's almost like a California villa, something, the total contrast of what you would ever see in the UK. It's white, it has huge glass doors that open to a beautiful garden that in the summer you can open the doors. We don't get much of a summer, but when we do, you can come in and out and feel at one with nature. And that really is something that they strive for. And actually Maggie's daughter is a landscape architect, Lily Jenks, and she's designed a number of the gardens as well. And the gardens are all, without exception, stunning. And they also run gardening clubs for people as well. So people, centre users as they call their participants, can come and be involved and plant vegetables, and they might be then the healthy food that you need to eat as a cancer sufferer. That all of these things add up to feeling better, I suppose. It's just that thing of making people feel better. And not necessarily, it's not curing people, but it's hopefully making them feel less bad, less awful.
Now, where can people see the film, or is there a website for the film?
No. The film is the copyright of the BBC.
Okay.
I was employed by the BBC when I was making it, so unfortunately it's not available online at the moment.
All right.
I guess BBC has an international site called BBC Store, where I think you maybe can buy it to download, but I'm not sure whether that's live yet.
Does the BBC tend to stream its stuff to Netflix or any of those services?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No. BBC is... I don't quite know where their international thing's going. This BBC Store thing is, I hope, going to be their international platform eventually.
Well, thank you very much for coming by and talking with me.
Thank you very much.
Hang on, in just a moment, George will be back with Thatcher Bean.
This is George Smart. I'm at the Architecture and Deisgn Film Festival in New York, talking to Thatcher Bean, who is the director of one of the festival entries, Made in Ilima, which is about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly Zaire, one of the most isolated places in the world. Welcome, Thatcher.
Yeah, thanks, George. Good to be here.
So you work with Mass Architecture firm in Boston.
That's right, Mass Design Group.
And you started their video operations?
We did. Yeah, I started working with Mass Design Group in 2013 on a part-time basis, and then after we collaborated for a little while, we decided to actually begin creating a production wing within the architecture firm. So producing films ourselves.
What was the first film you did?
The first film, we did a series of short films initially called Beyond the Building that were web pieces that explored a range of concepts ranging from how architecture can produce dignity, engender health, how it can potentially help engender peace. And last year we actually premiered our first 25-minute film at this festival called Design That Heals. That was about a cholera clinic that we helped design and build in collaboration with an organization in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, after the earthquake in 2010.
Cholera has become a big deal in that part of the world, I understand.
Yes, so...
particularly with the hurricanes and the lack of water.
That's right, yeah. And there had actually never been cholera in Haiti. It's debatable whether there had been, but there hadn't been for at least the last 100 years. And after the earthquake, since they had so little infrastructure in place already, and the earthquake damaged that even further, they had no way of dealing with the epidemic when it was introduced by the UN inadvertently. And so we worked with one of what we think is really one of the world's premier doctors, named Dr. Jean-William Pop, who's from Haiti, and he started one of the most successful health organizations in the country there. We worked with him to build a new system of sanitation infrastructure that could help, through the design of the building, actually treat patients and stop the spread of the disease.
Wow. Tell me about this film.
Yeah, would love to. So Made in Ilima is a film we just finished that's premiering tonight at 9 here. And it is about a school that we built in partnership with the African Wildlife Foundation and a community in Equator Province in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the school was built in a way, because it's such an isolated place, and in order to try to create new industries and skill sets, the school was built almost exclusively with local materials and with local craftsmen and local trainees that went to build the school. And then it was also built in a way that was meant to be beautiful to attract new students, and it has a conservation curriculum. So the big idea being that through the building of the school, there could be this large economic stimulus in this area so that these community members and our partners could develop in a way that they felt was positive and that helped preserve the biodiversity around them, particularly the bonobo ape, which is an endangered species there. And it only exists in that one place of the Congo.
So how isolated is this place? Is this like something we might see in a National Geographic special where they haven't really seen Westerners much, or has that come in already?
You know, it's interesting. I think we joked about not wanting to make this a David Attenborough documentary because I think often that's the association with places like this, but you'd be surprised when we got there, people had digital cameras. They had just started to get cell phone service around 6 hours away, which was getting closer, and they just, for the first time, had a satellite dish installed in the village, so they had internet access.
Okay.
It is a very isolated place. Many people from the community have been to Kinshasa before, but to get to Ilima, you have to either take a flight, around a 3 or 4 hour flight, and then spend 2 days on a motorcycle on kind of single wide 2 foot.
2 days on a motorcycle?
Yeah. There's a few ways to get in. One of the ways is you end up spending about 2 or 3 days on a motorcycle. Another way is you take a charter flight.
Why a motorcycle?
Yeah, there's no roads, so no formal roads. It's mostly just dirt and sand paths through a really dense forest.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, but the way we got in was through a charter flight that takes you within 6 hours by motorcycle. So then you spend 6 hours by motorcycle. But what that really means is that the building materials and that you are able to use are, the cost can really skyrockets if you're trying to bring a lot in. And there's a barge that comes near the village twice a year, But the project really tried to use this remote circumstance as an opportunity to create locally applicable technologies based on craft and knowledge that the community already had that they could use to build buildings that lasted longer, that were sustainable, beautiful.
This sounds like a moon colony. So there's a barge that comes twice a year.
That's right. So it's really one of the more remote places in the world.
And how do they get large objects from the barge to the village?
I'm not actually so sure about that. I think with probably a lot of effort, a lot of motorcycles, it's a challenge. It's definitely a place that is geographically isolated, not isolated from information necessarily.
Is it on a river or the coast? How does the barge make its way?
Yep. So it's near several rivers. The barges that go up into the interior of the Congo make its way near there. But our project really didn't rely on the barge as much as really investigating alongside the people in Ilima who had knowledge of the trees and the forests. Of the bricks for the project were made from clay and termite mounds mixed with palm oil and sand. And so as architects going into a place like that, I was told by the designer who lived there for almost 2 years, they didn't know the questions to ask. And so it would be presumptuous to come in and bring a lot of materials that might not be applicable once the architects left. And so it made more sense to come in and meet the people and live there for a long time to actually learn about the knowledge they had and the skills they had, and then really collaborate to build on that.
So how long did you visit?
I only visited for 3 weeks, but so there were 3 architects that actually traveled there, 2 from Kinshasa, and then 1 from the US named Andrew Brosey. Johnsy Mulela and Jonathan Bongi were the 2 architects from Kinshasa. And Andrew's wife, Rachel Brosey, ended up going to the Congo as well. And she was the one who really did an amazing job documenting the entire construction process, almost from start to finish. So,
which took how long?
It took over a year. I want to say around 18 months, but I would need to double check on that again. So I went in for a grand opening actually for 3 weeks and was there for relatively short period of time, but it was an incredible experience.
What kind of building did you put together? How large was it, and what did it do?
Yeah, so I believe it's 8 rooms, and it does a few different things. One is it has brick walls that go up to 2/3 of the height of the wall of the building, and it has a roof that is open air, so it protects from really heavy rain, but it also allows for circulation. A big problem that they had before the school was built is that students would have to bring building materials to the old school on a regular basis to maintain it. So,
like what? I mean, do you bring a 2x4? Do you bring a concrete block or a brick? Or
none of that outside of bricks. None of that would be available. But palm fronds to maintain the roof.
Palm fronds.
That's right. So the old school was built with palm fronds, or sometimes they would import sheet metal roofs.
Okay.
The problem with that is that when there's so much rain in the area that when it would rain, it would actually be so loud that the children would be sent home. So the idea with this was the roof was built out of wood shingles from a tree that was local to the area, that was resistant to termites and other insects. And so when it rains in the area, children are able to stay in the school and study. And since the school opened, there's been upwards of a 40% increase in the student body, just based on the other communities wanting to send their students there. Its reputation has really, really grown.
So I got to ask, how big a deal are termites in this area?
Yeah.
You're talking about termite mounds and...
Yeah, I mean, if you see the film, you'll get an idea of the scale of the termite mounds. But some of the termite mounds are roughly 2 or 3 stories tall. They're massive, so they're more like hills. But it was really fascinating because the school was sited kind of in between these 2 mounds, and so the bricks were being made on the actual site. So they were taking this clay from the termite mounds, mixing it with sand and palm oil. They were drying it in the open air, and then they were putting it into the building. So this entire process was hyper localized, And so these two mounds started to disappear as the building kind of started to grow out of the ground. And so one of the mounds was turned into this amphitheater for students. And
now, what about the termites? Did they mind this visit from the builders?
That's a good question. I'm not.
Where did the
actually
termites
sure.
go? Did they care?
I don't think we considered their feelings, unfortunately.
But I mean, did they resist? Did they? Did they put up much of a fight? Mounds that are a couple stories tall, I would think there are a couple of million termites in there.
Unfortunately, I do not know. I'm not an expert on termites, but I will make sure to check that out. That's a good question.
Well, now the school is how old?
So the school opened in 2015, so it's about 2 years old.
2 years old.
Yep.
Have they made plans for a next phase since this has been so successful?
Actually, I'm not aware of a next phase. When the school was designed, the community entered into an agreement with the African Wildlife Foundation where they would support its maintenance and curriculum and improve the pedagogy and the circumstances of the teachers. So we also helped design and build teachers' housing directly adjacent to the school. One of the big challenges that they had was attracting high-quality teachers that would stay in the area.
Sure.
It's a big ask for someone from an urban setting to really, go there. Even the two architects from Kinshasa were really surprised by this new context, even though they're Congolese. And so this teachers' housing started to attract better teachers. They had a new headmaster that they were really excited about, but I haven't been back. I would love to go back. It's really expensive to get there, pretty cost prohibitive, but I
imagine with the charter flight and the motorcycle riding. And
that's right, yeah. But, someday I hope to. And
maybe you could get on that barge on the twice-a-year jaunt.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to go back. It's a really amazing place.
Where can people find out more about the film? Is there a website?
Yeah, so massdesigngroup.org, our website. People can find out more there. That's where the majority of the information will be.
Well, thanks very much for stopping by, Thatcher.
Yeah, George, thank you. I appreciate it.
And that's all for today. Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is produced at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. The theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Cindy Stratton researches guests from her secret underground lair. Don't tell anybody. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. Visit us at usmodernist.org.